Hello, and welcome to the bonus episode of today's FYI on the Stones. If anything good comes out of this episode, I hope you stop calling them Los Rolling and you start calling them the Stones. Well, we're going to start off the bonus part talking about the world's most raucous frontman. And we looked at the word raucous in the first part of the show. A frontman is another way to say lead singer. And they don't get as iconic as Mick Jagger. But did you know he has a soft side? Well, he practices ballet, for example. His current girlfriend is a dancer and I think a model, well, judging by the looks of it. So I guess she rubbed off on him. In addition to that, he does running, swimming, Pilates, and yoga. So I guess that's why he's 80 years old and in tip-top shape. And he jumps around the stage like a monkey. I'm telling you, he was really limber. And limber means that you can move your body in all different ways without breaking it, or pulling a cramp or something like that. It reminds me of people who do yoga or gymnastics. They're usually limber. Great adjective. And when he has a day off, he's just an everyday normal guy. He spends his downtime the way a lot of people do, just chillaxing. According to him, I get up as late as possible, have breakfast as late as possible, do a tiny bit in the gym, go out for a walk, and read a book. That sounds like something I do. Well, without the gym part. My point is, he has pretty normal hobbies. He's also an avid cricket fan. I don't know about you guys, but this is kind of like a contrast, if you will. A paradox, because he seems like this rock and roll rebel, but then when you find out about him, he's just a really normal guy, at least at this stage in his life. He's come a long way from those days when he used to hang out at Studio 54 with all those models, and we don't want to even talk about all the drugs they were consuming. And everybody knew they were consuming drugs. In fact, they got busted several times. They are no strangers to being arrested. But I guess it's part of the rock and roll style, isn't it? Also, Mick Jagger has 8 kids. They range from 6 years old to 52 years old at the time of this recording. And now that I think about it, I guess that's why he's still touring. Well, if he's got to support 8 kids, that's a lot of mouths to feed, as we say. Now, Keith Richards, on the other hand, he isn't as healthy, or at least wasn't. And there's a rumor going around that he had a blood transfusion and all the blood was drained from his body. Does it sound ridiculous? It's because it is. It was a rumor he made up. But still, you've got to say, the guy's a walking miracle. He's done more drugs than probably anybody on earth. And there he is, playing his guitar on stage in front of thousands of screaming fans. But one time in Keith Richards' past, he went 9 days without a wink. A wink is another way of saying of sleep. And he partied like a rock star. Never said better. 9 days, can you believe that? On the go. Now again, there were probably some serious drugs involved. But he said in his autobiography, I fell asleep standing up eventually. I was just putting another cassette back on the shelf, and I was feeling great. And I turned round and fell asleep. I fell against the edge of the speaker. So he was burning the candle at both ends, as we say. And this means, another way of saying it, is to stretch yourself too thin. Abarcas demasiado y no das para todo. You bite off more than you can chew. Hey, we're looking at a lot of idiomatic expressions, and it's not even time for the vocabulary section. As I said in the first part, we'll take a look at some records that they have shattered. One thing is to break something, and one thing is to shatter it into a million pieces. And the Rolling Stones tour, A Bigger Bang, which was the 2005 to 2007 tour, grossed over $558 million. This made it the most lucrative tour in history at that time. Another record that they shattered was the largest rock concert ever. They performed at the Copacabana Beach in Rio, Brazil in 2006. in front of a staggering 1.5 million fans. And Mick Jagger had a nice little touch with everybody because he addressed the crowd in Portuguese throughout the show. So he really did his homework. And I've seen that with many groups. The moment you say a couple sentences in the local language, you win over the crowd. Well, just imagine addressing the crowd in their language throughout the whole show. I guess they feel respected. They feel like you're interested in their culture. And I think the people who were at that show will never forget it as long as they live. In 2016, the Rolling Stones became the first international rock band to play in Cuba. Rock was banned on state TV and radio for many, many years. Finally, when they lifted the ban, there was a free concert that was attended by more than 100,000 fans. And as we said before, they're not showing any signs of quitting. Back in 2003, Mick Jagger was knighted. This is to become a knight. And he was knighted for his services to popular music. And what did Keith Richards think about this? Well, he was highly skeptical of this knighthood. He thinks it goes against the Stones' anti-establishment behavior. We're not chivalrous knights. We're rock and roll rebels, man. What kind of image are you trying to give people? But the irony of it all is Keith Richards was a Boy Scout when he was a little tyke. So I guess he should keep his mouth shut about that. There's nothing less rock and roll than the Boy Scouts. In the Boy Scouts, you're taught to follow orders, respect, love, all those morals and values and all that. And in rock and roll, it's, F the system. The system is the establishment, the powers that be, el sistema. Rock music in general is a middle finger to the system. So, being knighted by the royal family, it's just not rock and roll. I get it, Keith. But Keith also said that his experiences as a Boy Scout taught him the value of loyalty. And even though Mick and Keith have had their ups and downs, they've remained loyal friends throughout the years. And eventually, Keith Richards was thrown out of the Boy Scouts. So he didn't quit the Boy Scouts. He was thrown out for getting into a brawl. A brawl is another way of saying a fight. And these guys were bad boys. They were always getting in trouble with the law. One time in 1972, ahead of a show in Boston, Jagger and Richards were arrested and thrown in jail for assault. There was a fight that broke out at the airport in Rhode Island, and they were taken away in a police car. You got to remember, wherever the Rolling Stones went, chaos followed them. But the mayor at the time, Kevin White, he said, "Over my dead body. What are you kidding me? We're going to cancel a concert when we already have a rowdy crowd?" So he went to the jail and he bailed them out. They ended up riding over to the gig in a limousine with a complete police escort. And the show went on. I'm sure that night many riots were avoided. And I guess you could say that it wasn't just fighting and drugs, but also tax evasion. Now, I don't know if they ever got in trouble for it, but I do know that when they recorded their album Exile on Main Street, my favorite one, as I said, in 1972, they did it in the south of France. And the reason they recorded it there was because they loved French wine. Okay, that wasn't the real reason, but I imagine that was a nice secondary reason. But seriously, it was to avoid high taxes in England. And since then, they have also found these different tax schemes so they don't have to be taxed as much. You can call them criminals or just smart. Nobody says that you can't register your company in Amsterdam, especially if there's a very low tax rate on royalties in Amsterdam. And where do rock groups make a lot of their money? On royalties. So they've always been trying to get around the tax laws, at least the ones in England. And they've all started foundations. The group is set up like a company. I mean, they've really done their homework. And that was because their bookkeeper at the time said, "Oh man, you guys owe a lot of money. We got to figure something out." And from that exile, which was a real exile, came the album Exile on Main Street. Again, if you haven't heard it, give it a listen. It's a double album, and it is amazing. Unless you're Mick Jagger and you say it's overrated. We talked before about the Beatles connection. Well, there are more Beatles connections over here. For example, Decca Records, which had initially declined to sign a deal with the Beatles, gave the Rolling Stones a recording contract that was very favorable. So imagine that. Decca Records, they passed over the Beatles, but they weren't going to let that happen with the Rolling Stones. And the band received a royalty rate 3 times as high as the average at that time. They also had full artistic control of their recordings and ownership of the recording master tapes. This was unheard of at that time. So they were signed by the record label that turned down the Beatles. Another connection was Mick Jagger contributed backing vocals, and Brian Jones played the oboe on the Beatles' Baby You're a Rich Man. In return, Lennon and McCartney sang backing vocals on We Love You. And there are other links between the two as well. But let's just put it this way. They respected each other, and they realized that there was room for both of them at the top. Another cool pop culture fact is the album cover for Sticky Fingers was designed by legendary pop artist Andy Warhol. Sticky Fingers is the one that has the jeans, and then it has a working zipper, and you can open it up, and then you see the underwear. Now, obviously, this was quite controversial. But on the other hand, it was also revolutionary. Nobody had ever seen like a 3D album before where you could actually zip it up. So even their albums were on the cutting edge, the artwork. Another one that was quite controversial was the album artwork of Beggar's Banquet. It showed a toilet and a bathroom, and it had some writing on the wall. And people thought it was way too controversial to show a toilet. So they changed it to make it look more like an invitation. Hey, beggars can't be choosers. No. Beggars can't be choosers. Well, this is an expression that means, let's say, for example, you say, Alberto, do you have a piece of gum? And I say, yeah, sure, here. I've got strawberry gum. And you're like, well, I don't really like strawberry gum. I like mint gum. And that's when I say to you, beggars can't be choosers. I told you I was going to tell you about this other member that nobody's really ever heard of. Unless you're a Rolling Stones geek, you won't know who Ian Stewart is. He often went by the name Stu, and he was an original member of the Rolling Stones. But he was fired at the beginning because they felt that he didn't have that rock star look. It had nothing to do with his talent. He just didn't have the right look. And he continued to play piano for the band. He also worked as their road manager until he died in 1985. But imagine that. Imagine somebody telling you, guy, the band's going to sign a deal, but you just don't look the part. Sorry. You're not rock and roll enough. But Keith Richards is the first to admit that we are only here because of Ian Stewart. Without him, the band would never have existed. So he's like that mystery member. And what about this song? She's got the moves like Jagger. She's got the moves like Jagger. What do you think? You think Mick Jagger likes this song? It's a song by Maroon 5. It came out in 2010, and it's named after his famous dance skills. Well, he loves the song. In fact, he said he found it very flattering. I've got the moves like Jagger. I've got the moves like Jagger. And I'm sure a lot of young people were like, who's this Jagger guy? I'm going to look him up. And that's how younger generations discover older music. How did we discover a lot of these blues artists, Muddy Waters, and all of these guys? Through the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. I always say if you like a certain artist, you got to listen to the artist that artist listened to. Who was their influence? And then it all clicks. It all comes together. But countless groups have been influenced by the Rolling Stones. And if they say they haven't been influenced by them, they're lying. One of my favorite Rolling Stones songs is Gimme Shelter. And there we can look at the pronunciation of give me. A lot of times we don't pronounce that V. We say gimme, gimme, gimme shelter. And man, what an amazing song. Mary Clayton sings the vocals, and I'm telling you, it just penetrates every inch of your body. And the lyrics, just like many of their lyrics, are just dark but amazing. She sings at the top of her lungs. She says, rape, murder, it's just a shot away. Está solamente a un tiro. Rape, murder, it's just a shot away. It's just a shot away. Rape, murder. But then at the end of the song, he says, love, sister, is just a kiss away. So you decide. You're one step away from war or love. That's a pretty strong message. And then when Mary Clayton and Mick Jagger are singing it together and there's that crescendo, it's amazing. When I saw them in concert, they opened with this song. And Martin Scorsese is such a big fan of this song that he's used it in 4 of his films. I remember it from Casino, or was it Goodfellas? Well, either way, Martin Scorsese loves the Stones, and as we said, he loves the blues. He's even got a documentary on the blues. And he directed a live concert film for the Rolling Stones called Shine a Light. Other movie connections over here. George Lucas worked as a camera operator on the documentary, or as we call it, rockumentary, Gimme Shelter. And we're going to talk about Gimme Shelter now because it was that documentary where one of the most tragic concerts ever happened. Some say it was the end of the hippie era. And this was a concert that took place at the Altamont Speedway. A speedway or a raceway is a place where they have races with cars. And they performed a free concert there in 1969. This was in California. And as I said, this kind of, according to many people who documented it, journalists, and people who lived it, said that it marked the end of peace and love, because the 60s was all about peace and love. But this concert was not about peace and love. Lives were lost. Nobody should ever lose their life at a fun event. You're going there to have the best night of your life, and you end up having the worst. And this concert was held on December 6th, 1969 at the Altamont Speedway, as I said. Approximately 300,000 people attended the gig. And they were billing it as the Woodstock of the West. Because if you remember, in 1969, the Woodstock Festival took place in New York, just 4 months earlier. But the Altamont Speedway Free Festival was not known for love and peace like Woodstock. The event is tragically remembered for its use of the Hells Angels motorcycle gang. They decided to use them as security, and that was a bad idea. You don't want to hire outlaws to do security. But also there were a lot of other factors that went into it. They changed the venue several times, so 2 days before the concert, they changed the venue. So the stage now was at the bottom of a hill, so they wanted protection. So they hired these guys. The Grateful Dead and other people said that they had hired them in the past, and they could protect the stage and the equipment. So there was no stampede or people crushed or anything like that. And instead of avoiding a lot of these situations, it seems like the Hells Angels exacerbated them. One guy was killed. An 18-year-old named Meredith Hunter was killed in the audience by a Hells Angel guy. There were also 3 accidental deaths, 2 by a hit-and-run car accident. Think about that, a hippie festival, and you hit somebody with your car, kill them, and you jet. Not cool. Not hippie-like. Another death was due to an LSD-induced drowning in a nearby irrigation canal. And there were scores of injured people, cars were stolen, property damage. It was an embarrassment. And again, if you want to learn more about this festival, you've got to check out the rockumentary Gimme Shelter. But it just shows that poor planning can even result in death. And you got to be careful who you hire. Because As the story goes, they paid the Hells Angels $500 in beer. And all they had to do was sit at the edge of the stage and drink beer. But once they started using pool cues as weapons and getting in fights with people, things got ugly. Now, if you ask the Hells Angels now, they say that they didn't do anything wrong. But it's all on video, you can be the judge. In fact, a lot of people have criticized the Gimme Shelter documentary because it kind of takes the blame off the Rolling Stones completely, when they're just as guilty as everybody else. But I get that he didn't want to stop the concert, even though they had to stop in the middle of a few songs. He knew, he being Mick Jagger, that if he stopped the concert, it would be even worse. There would be a full-fledged riot. So the show must go on, but it was a dark day in rock and roll history. Another dark day in rock and roll history was the day Brian Jones died. As we said, he left the band. He was the original leader of the band. He named the band, but he couldn't cope with his alcohol and drug problems. And he became unreliable, and he started losing protagonism within the group. And in 1969, he quit or was dismissed, whatever. They parted ways. Less than a month later, Brian Jones died by drowning in the swimming pool at his home. There are many documentaries on this infamous night, and some people say that he was killed. Again, it's too much to go into here on the show, but there are many documentaries. Just search for Brian Jones' death. But I guess he really lived that rock and roll style. Live fast, die young. And the Rolling Stones, well, the rest of them, they're living the opposite. They're standing the test of time, even against all logic, such as the case of Keith Richards. Also, as I said, they were arrested many times. Most times it was for possession. For example, in February 1967, Jagger and Richards were arrested at Keith Richards' home. They were arrested for drug possession. And what happened was, there was this tabloid, the News of the World, which was starting to publish stories on a lot of famous musicians and their drug use and their partying habits. And what happened? Well, the police started taking note. And one by one, they started raiding and busting these artists. They were convicted, they spent a night in prison, but in the end, they decided not to prosecute them. But the Stones in general, they have quite a rap sheet. A rap sheet is another way of saying a criminal record. But again, isn't that what rebellion is? They're just playing their role. Let's take a look at some vocabulary and idioms. The word groupie was supposedly coined by Bill Wyman, the bassist, when they were in Australia. An expression that comes to mind when I think of the Stones is to live life in the fast lane. We looked at this expression earlier, to burn the candle at both ends. Same idea there. Eventually, you'll burn out. An expression that comes to mind when I think about Mick Jagger dancing, he's strutting or strutting his stuff. I think you say pavonear. It's like to walk around with some importance, a little bit of swagger. Hey, there's a good way to remember it. Jagger has swagger. We looked at the expression, a stone's throw, a tiro de piedra. We also have another one, to kill two birds with one stone. Very similar to the one in Spanish. Also, if something is set in stone. Okay, guys, the party is Wednesday. It's set in stone. Cerrado, concretado. And have you ever heard the expression, leave no stone unturned? It means to search thoroughly. In Spanish, no dejar rincón sin revisar. Or no dejar piedra sobre piedra, it says here. Remover cielo y tierra, that's the one I've heard. To leave no stone unturned. I will leave no stone unturned until I find out who did it. And today on the show, we let the good times roll. Do you remember this idiomatic expression? We looked at it in our New Orleans episode. It's the motto of the city. Let the good times roll. Que siga el buen rollo. We like to let the good times roll here on FYI. And to wrap up, I'm going to tell you something Mick Jagger said in 1975. And now he has to eat his words. In 1975, he didn't think he'd be performing for much longer. He told People magazine, I only meant to do it for 2 years. I guess the band would just disperse one day and say goodbye. I would continue to write and sing, but I'd rather be dead than sing Satisfaction when I'm 45. And of course, he's still playing Satisfaction at 80. So I guess we can quote another one of their songs. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometime, you just might find you get what you need. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode of FYI.